How do you really define yourself? I mean, are you primarily an individual, forging your own path, totally independent?
Or are you maybe more fundamentally shaped by the groups you belong to, your family, your culture, your nation?
A pretty deep question, right? Gets right to the core.
Absolutely. It's one of those fundamental questions about how we see ourselves and our place in the world. Echoes through history, really.
And today, we're doing a deep dive into two, well, incredibly influential thinkers from the 20th century who wrestled with this exact tension, but from completely opposite ends.
Yeah, diametrically opposed. We're talking Henri Tajfel, the social psychologist behind social identity theory.
And Ayn Rand, the philosopher of objectivism.
Exactly. And our mission here is to kind of unpack their core ideas, pull out the most important insights.
And show you why understanding both of them, even though they clash so hard, is actually crucial for getting a handle on so many debates happening right now.
It really is. And what's so striking is that both Tajfel and Rand were profoundly shaped by the collectivist ideologies and conflicts of the 20th century, World War II, communism,
Huge impact on both.
but their personal experiences took them down completely different roads. It's like the same fire forged completely different metals.
A really powerful image.
Mhm.
So let's start with Henri Tajfel. Born in Poland, 1919, later became a British social psychologist.
And his personal story is just inseparable from his work. And honestly, it's heartbreaking. Fought in the French army in World War II, captured, prisoner of war.
And then found out he'd lost most of his family in the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Just unimaginable trauma.
Yeah. And that experience, that loss, it really ignited this lifelong question in him. Why do people discriminate?
Right. Especially why does this us versus them thing happen even when there's no obvious conflict, no real reason for it, no big differences between the groups?
He was really pushing back against the psychology at the time, wasn't he? Which tended to blame prejudice on, like, disturbed individuals or authoritarian personalities. Exactly. Tajfel thought it was something, well, more ordinary, something baked into how our minds work, how we categorize the world, not just about bad apples.
Which brings us straight to social identity theory, or SIT.
Yep. The core idea of SIT is that our self-concept, who we think we are, comes from two main places.
Okay, what are they?
Your personal identity,
Mm.
your unique quirks, skills, achievements, the things that make you you, and your social identity, which comes from the groups you feel you belong to.
And the motivation behind all this, Tajfel said, is trying to feel good about ourselves, have a positive self-concept.
Precisely. We're driven to achieve and maintain a positive sense of self.
So how do groups fit into that?
Through a process he called social categorization. It's this fundamental thing our brains do almost automatically. We classify ourselves and others into groups.
It's like jobs, religions, nationalities, even things like which sports team you root for.
All of those. And this simple act creates in-groups, the US, and out-groups, the them. And Tajfel argued this categorization itself is a really powerful trigger for discrimination.
So it's not just that groups tell us who we are, giving us that social identity.
Right. They also directly feed into our self-esteem. Belonging makes us feel good about ourselves, assuming the group is seen positively.
That's a powerful link. Identity and self-worth tied together through the group.
It absolutely is. And because we want that self-esteem boost, we engage in social comparison. We compare our in-group with out-groups.
Trying to make us look better than them.
Essentially, yes. We aim for what Tajfel called positive distinctiveness, finding ways our group is superior on some dimension we value, maybe smarter or more cultured or, more successful.
What if the comparison doesn't look so good? If your group seems, well, less prestigious or valued?
Good question. Tajfel talked about strategies. You might try to exit the group psychologically or actually leave or pass, like conceal your membership if possible. Or, and this is key for social change, you might engage in voice. That means collective action to improve the group's standing or challenge the negative comparison.
Okay, that makes sense theoretically, but it still feels a bit abstract. How did he show this actually works, that just categorization is enough?
This is where his most famous experiments come in. The minimal group paradigm. Brilliant, really, in how simple they were.
Minimal group, meaning?
Meaning the groups were based on the most trivial, meaningless criteria imaginable. Seriously, things like telling people they preferred paintings by Klee over Kandinsky based on nothing much. Or even just a coin toss assigning them to Group X or Group Y.
So no history, no real connection, no conflict, just Labels.
Exactly. Pure categorization. And here's the kicker, the really startling finding.
What happened?
Even in these minimal groups with no interaction or reason for animosity, when people were asked to allocate points or resources between anonymous members of their own group and the other group,
They favor their own group.
consistently, they gave more to their in-group members, and often they'd choose an option that maximized the difference between the groups, even if it meant their own group got less overall in absolute terms.
Wow. So they'd rather get, say, 7 points while the other group gets 1 than have everyone, including their own group, get 10 points.
That kind of pattern, yes. It showed a preference for relative gain over absolute gain, just to establish that positive distinctiveness. We're better off compared to them.
That's kind of disturbing, isn't it? It suggests this us versus them thing isn't just learned hatred or competition over real stuff. It's like a switch in our heads that flips just by drawing a line.
It was a radical idea at the time. It challenged the focus on personality flaws or real-world competition as the only sources of prejudice. Tajfel showed that mere social categorization seems to be enough, a fundamental cognitive tendency.
And the implications of that are huge for understanding society.
Absolutely. SIT became a cornerstone. It helps explain intergroup conflict, ethnocentrism, why people feel pride in their culture, but also things like internalized depression or self-hatred in groups that are constantly devalued by society.
And it gives a psychological underpinning for collective action, right? People aren't just fighting for resources, but for recognition, for their group's status, which ties back to their own self-esteem.
Precisely. It highlights how deeply our individual well-being can be tied to the fate and perception of our groups.
Okay, now let's completely switch gears. Let's talk about Ayn Rand.
A very different thinker indeed. Born Elisa Rosenbaum in Russia, 1905, emigrated to the U.S. in 1926, became a novelist and philosopher.
And like Tajfel, her early experiences were formative, but pushed her in the absolute opposite direction. Witnessing the Bolshevik Revolution, her father's business being confiscated, the brutality of communism.
It fueled this fierce, lifelong advocacy for individual rights and a deep hostility towards any form of collectivism. Coming to America was, for her, an escape to intellectual and artistic freedom.
Her philosophy is objectivism. How'd you sum that up?
At its heart, it's a philosophy of rational individualism. Rand herself put it pretty powerfully. The concept of man as a heroic being, with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute.
So the individual is paramount, absolutely central.
Completely. She had that famous line, "There is no such thing as a collective brain." For her, we are distinct individuals, each with our own mind, senses, values. Society is just a collection of individuals.
Which means she totally rejected sacrificing the individual for the group.
Utterly. That idea was abhorrent to her, which leads to her concept of rational selfishness.
It sounds, well, selfish.
Right, and she embraced the term but redefined it. It wasn't about exploiting others or acting on whims. It meant that your own life and your own pursuit of happiness, guided by reason, is your highest moral purpose. Acting rationally in your self-interest is good.
And altruism, the idea of living for others.
She saw that as a destructive morality, a code of self-sacrifice that she believed destroyed human potential and happiness.
And reason is the key to all this.
Reason is everything in objectivism. It's our unique tool for survival, for understanding reality, for making choices. Emotions are consequences of our premises, not guides to action. You rely on logic and objective reality.
Tied to that is productive achievement.
Yes, creating value, whether material or spiritual, through your own effort. She saw it as the noblest activity, essential for life and self-esteem. It's how you shape the world and sustain yourself.
And underpinning the social structure she advocated were individual rights.
Absolutely fundamental. Defined as moral principles protecting your freedom of action in a social context. The basic right is the right to your own life.
And property rights flow from that.
Indispensably, in her view. The right to keep and use the product of your own effort. And crucially, these are negative rights.
Meaning they just require others to not interfere, not to use force or fraud against you.
Exactly. They impose no positive obligations on others to provide you with anything. She rejected concepts like collective rights or rights to healthcare or housing, seeing them as violations of the rights of those forced to provide them.
Objectivism isn't just politics, though, is it? It's a whole system.
It's comprehensive. Metaphysics reality is objective. Epistemology reason is our means of knowledge. Ethics, rational self-interest. Politics, laissez-faire capitalism. Even aesthetics about art representing reality and ideal humans. It all interconnects.
And politically, that led her to be a radical for capitalism. What did that mean in practice?
It meant the only moral political system is one based on individual rights, which requires a complete separation of state and economics, like separation of church and state.
So, minimal government.
Radically minimal. Its only legitimate function is to protect rights, police, courts, military funded voluntarily if possible, any government intervention in the economy, any regulation, any welfare, she saw as immoral infringements on individual liberty.
It all comes back to the individual. She had that phrase, man is a being of self-made soul.
Yes. The idea that your character, your values, your achievements are the result of your choices, your thinking, it places a tremendous emphasis on individual agency and responsibility.
And tends to downplay or even dismiss the role of social factors, background, luck.
Very much so. For Rand, your success or failure is primarily down to your own rational effort or lack thereof.
Okay, so we've got Tajfel's socially embedded individual, shaped by groups,
Yeah.
and Rand's sovereign, self-made individual. Let's put them head to head. Where's the core clash?
It really starts with the self-concept itself. For Tajfel, as we said, it's composite. Personal and social identity are intertwined. We exist on this continuum, sometimes acting as individuals, sometimes as group members. Our identity is inherently social.
For Rand.
For Rand, that's just wrong. Personal identity, the self-made soul, is everything. Defining yourself by a group is a betrayal of your individuality. Society is just a number of individual men. True identity comes from your own mind, your own efforts, not from belonging.
It's a fundamental disagreement about what it even means to be human. Social creature versus independent rational agent.
Absolutely, and that flows into morality. Tajfel's work suggests our values are at least partly shaped by our groups and the need for positive identity, which can, lead to bias. Our way is the right way.
Rand wouldn't stand for that.
Not at all. For her, ethics are objective, derived by reason from the requirements of human life. Morality is about rational self-interest. It's chosen by the individual, not absorbed from a group. She'd see group-based morality as inherently irrational and dangerous.
What about conflict? Tajfel's experiments suggest conflict, or at least bias, is almost built in, arising from mere categorization.
Right. That us versus them tendency seems deeply rooted in our cognition, according to SIT, almost a default state.
Rand completely rejects that, doesn't she?
Completely. She argued that rational individuals pursuing their self-interest have no fundamental conflicts. Their interests are harmonious because value is created through production and voluntary trade, which is mutually beneficial.
So where does conflict come from, in her view?
From irrationality, from the initiation of force, and especially from what she called altruist collectivist ethics that demand self-sacrifice and pit people against each other over scarce resources instead of encouraging production.
Leading to totally different visions of a good society. Tajfel implies we need to understand and manage group dynamics, maybe foster broader identities, promote positive contact.
We work with our psychology. Whereas Rand says the ideal is pure laissez-faire capitalism. Protect individual rights, get the government out of the way, and let rational individuals trade freely. Society takes care of itself when individuals are free.
Okay, here's maybe the crux of its self-esteem. This seems like a real paradox.
It really highlights the divide. Tajfel links self-esteem directly to both personal achievement and the status of your group. Feeling good about your group makes you feel good about yourself.
So things that improve your group's standing, like fighting discrimination, directly impact psychological well-being for its members.
That's the implication, yes. Group status matters for individual psychology.
But Rand ties self-esteem almost exclusively to individual achievement and rational living. It's something you earn through your own efforts and choices, your productive work. It's internal, not dependent on what others think of your group.
Exactly. Genuine self-worth comes from being a rational, productive individual. Relying on group validation is, for her, a sign of a second-hander, someone who lives through others.
So think about something like affirmative action or diversity initiatives. From a Tajfel perspective, you could argue they're needed to counter group-based discrimination and boost the psychological well-being and status of marginalized groups.
Plausible within that framework, yes. Addressing the negative distinctiveness.
But from a Randian perspective,
They'd likely be seen as unjust violations of individual rights and meritocracy. Judging people by group affiliation rather than individual merit is fundamentally immoral in her view. It prioritizes the collective over the individual.
that really lays bare the tension. How do we even define well-being? Is it individual or is it tied up with group identity and status?
A fundamental disagreement, which obviously plays out in debates about social justice and inequality.
Tajfel's work gives a psychological mechanism for how systemic inequalities can arise and persist through group categorization and bias. It validates the idea of collective struggle against discrimination.
While Rand would argue inequality in a free market is mostly the natural result of differing individual abilities, choices, and efforts. Attempts to engineer equality of outcome through government intervention are unjust and ultimately harm everyone by stifling productivity and infringing liberty.
Okay, let's talk critiques and legacies.
Yeah.
How has Tajfel's social identity theory held up?
Well, it's undeniably had a massive impact. It really shifted social psychology away from pure individualism. It's a cornerstone theory.
But not without critics.
No theory is. Some critiques, especially from certain schools of European psychology, questioned if it fully escaped a kind of psychological reductionism, maybe underplaying broader historical or economic forces. Does it fully bridge the individual's social gap? Debates continue.
But still foundational in the field.
Absolutely. For understanding groups, prejudice, conflict, it's essential, and it keeps evolving, like with self-categorization theory, which refines some aspects.
Now, Rand and objectivism. Academically.
Yeah.
It's a different story, right?
Very different. Her novels, Atlas Shrugged, The Fountainhead, sold millions and millions. Huge popular reach.
But in academic philosophy departments.
Generally ignored or dismissed. Critiques often mention a lack of rigorous argumentation, a polemical style, maybe not engaging deeply with opposing views. Her ethics of rational selfishness is particularly controversial among philosophers.
Specific criticisms.
Things like questioning her metaphysical arguments, her theory of knowledge, and the charge that objectivism functions like a closed system, resistant to internal critique or development. Some find the ethical framework just too harsh, even morally bankrupt.
Strong words. Yet despite that academic cold shoulder.
It's had a persistent and significant influence outside academia, particularly among libertarians, especially right libertarians and some conservatives in the U.S. Her ideas pop up in economics, politics, business culture.
So it's this fascinating contrast. Tajfel, huge academic impact, less direct popular name recognition. Rand, largely dismissed by academics, but massive popular influence that bypassed the usual gatekeepers through her novels.
It really highlights different paths to influence, doesn't it? Narrative versus scientific framework.
So can we reconcile these two, Tajfel and Rand?
Honestly, probably not at a fundamental level. Their starting points about human nature and reality are just too different.
Tajfel's giving us a psychological description of how group identity works and affects us.
Right. It's descriptive, based on empirical observation. Rand is offering a prescriptive philosophy, how we should live, what should be valued, how society should be organized, based on her axiom.
Different projects entirely.
Pretty much. Psychology versus normative philosophy.
But even if they can't be synthesized, there's value in understanding both.
Oh, absolutely. You need both perspectives, I think, to get a fuller picture of the human condition. Tajfel gives us indispensable tools for understanding prejudice, group conflict, why collective action happens, essential for navigating diverse societies.
And Rand.
Rand provides this incredibly potent, if controversial, defense of individualism, reason, and liberty. Her ideas force you to grapple with fundamental questions about freedom, responsibility, and the role of the state. They continue to fuel major political and economic debates.
So maybe the takeaway isn't choosing one, but seeing the tension itself.
Seeing that constant interplay between our individual drives and our undeniable existence within social groups.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener. Given these starkly different ways of looking at the world,
What does pursuing well-being actually mean for you? And what kind of society do you think truly supports that?
is it a society that acknowledges our group nature, maybe tries to manage it, lift groups to help individuals?
Or is it one that prioritizes freeing the individual above all else, believing that's the ultimate path to well-being for both the person and society?
Something to chew on.